Welcome to the UIUC Talkshow, a show where we talk with the most interesting people with the most interesting ideas. Today we have Dr. Neal Davis. Welcome.
I'm pleased to be here.
So I want to start with what in your 20s you said that you read a lot of philosophy books, and you say that your philosophy of life is to increase the elevate sentient life, which, to increase light and to, do things like this. Do you still consider that your philosophy of life to this day?
Oh, we're starting off with the softball questions, huh? So, what I've been trying to reason about and figure out, sort of the question that's been driving what became my philosophical readings, to some extent my academic journey, the projects I've been working on before and since, and at the same time, has been kind of the perennial philosophical question of like, what is the good life, right? Like, what does it look like to live well? What is wisdom? What does it look like to be wise? And so your comment there that I boiled it down into this epigram. If you were an ancient Greek philosopher, then you'd try and write it down as a very short phrase, because maybe someone would actually write down that phrase and your name would get remembered, because a lot of them, that's literally all we know is some epigram that they wrote down sometime. Is elevate sentience or elevate sapience, right? That the idea is to increase your own and others' capacity as much as you possibly can. This means building structures. It means building institutions. It means building relationships, right? There are things you can do at scale with humans. And there are things that you cannot do at scale with humans, right? It sort of gets at Dunbar's number and the limits of knowability, the limits of the scope of your community or the village with whom you regularly interact. But what I think we are doing as humans when we are at our best is we are trying to build tight-knit communities that give ourselves and others the space to experiment, try, explore what human flourishing looks like in various ways. Just, I've been chasing out the ramifications of that, hopefully somewhat successfully, ever since I happened on that formulation.
I think that's true. I think we all, in a way, we sort of try to create projects and communities, and I guess for us here, we created the UIUC Talkshow as a way to, we find meaning from deep conversations, and we don't want to talk about the homework and assignments, and just how can we actually get back to what college was supposed to be like. Mm-hmm. And that's something that we try to do. So you mentioned something that was interesting. You mentioned that elevating sapiens is about creating institutions and doing sometimes at a scale. You mentioned something that was interesting recently, is that you said that how everything will be done in the future will be through DAOs.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
I have been thinking for a question, and I have not been able to figure it out. And I think the reason is because I don't know how to frame it. I don't know the angle of attack. So my question, and to give you more context on what I'm going to ask you, is that I believe that if you align the incentives, you can rule the world. Like, everything is about alignments. If you can mm-hmm. figure out the alignments, you can figure out anything you want. You can do anything you want. So it's all about alignments. And a DAO and an institution and a company is all about alignment incentive. And really what you're trying to do is align the incentive through some sort of a movement or belief, which I think Urbit has done really well. Mm-hmm. And so I'm wondering, with that in context, we're here in a college, 50,000 people, and something I've been thinking, it's like, how can you align the incentives of, it doesn't have to be 50,000 people, it could be 1,000 people. You can get together and do something cool, like Wikipedia. It was literally created with 2,000 people. It's mm-hmm. one of the best things that ever will be created in the history of the world, whatever. How can you align the incentives, and How can you think through that question?
So I think part of what's going on, if you think about something like Wikipedia, is that there's a very strong filtration process, right? It's not that they're grabbing 2,000 random humans, right? There are a lot of steps that lead a human to say, I think that investing massive amounts of my time and energy in building a free encyclopedia as a monument of human knowledge is worthwhile. And so in a sense, what you're looking at is not just alignment of incentives, it's discovering the incentives that people already have, the values that people already hold. And then you can take two approaches at this point. One is you can optimize over giving people what they want in a way that they understand. And this can vary. I think there's a lot of political variations of this formulation where or maybe sometimes sometimes you're argued with in a sense, right? People are telling you that's not really what you want. You want this other thing, which happens to be the thing that I'm giving you. A lot of marketing and advertising is sort of in that vein. But the other thing that you can do then is you build your community, your organization, by sifting out the people who have the sufficiently aligned incentives to find what you are trying to do, what you are seeking, valuable to them. I think to some extent, if we're talking about a DAO as a decentralized autonomous organization and what the internet more broadly has been accomplishing, it looks much more like the latter. It's people are discovering common interests, common values in ways that embedded in a particular physical community, they may not ever be able to discover. And this has been finding a lot of different expressions, ways people have been talking about and building this. Very early on in the internet days, a lot of this was, just people building group chats, building forums. Those have continued to exist and will continue to exist in various forms that we'll always call a group chat, but it's moved from Discord to Signal to other sorts of platforms. Then there's also things like Balaji Srinivasan's recently written about the network state idea, the idea that you could perhaps start building decentralized states that have state-like capacities, government-like capacities, but do not physically exist in a territory that is coterminous with the influence of that entity. And this has been explored in fiction, things like Neal Stephenson's The Diamond Age. I think Snow Crash had a sub-theme of this kind of setup as well. There's some interesting ideas there. There's also a sense in which religion is already a network state, in a way. You do have people with aligned interests who are physically distributed and hold goods in common and values in common,
and by the internet in a way.
Right, and or even pre-internet, right? They may not have a governance token or something that we would associate with whatever the next iteration of that will look like. And so I think my argument about the future looking DAO-ish really hinges on the fact that decentralized organizations have certain adaptive benefits when you are building things. It's easier to reach people in some ways. It's harder to get engagement in the same way that you would if you had a family, or you have a Lions Club or a Rotary Club, where everyone is physically in the same town working on the same project. So there's a trade-off there. It's not to say you couldn't organize a Masonic Lodge or a Knights of Columbus or an American Legion along the lines of a DAO. It's just that it would sort of be that physical thing first and the DAO secondarily. But what DAOs do offer you is the ability to escape or work around limitations that centralized organizations and institutions often have. It gives you ways of quickly distributing and determining things. There are different bylaw schemes and governance schemes that different DAOs have put in place. There's platforms like ADAO. I forget what ADAO actually stands for, ADAO. But what they are doing is they're trying to build a theory of governance for DAOs that they can then communicate to other DAOs of like, okay, this is like how you set things up in a way that is good for what you're doing. And you have some government recognition of this as well. So Illinois has a law that recognizes smart contracts as being legally binding. Wyoming has put in place a kind of a DAO LLC legal structure, which is a very interesting idea. Wyoming's implementation is actually really flawed, unfortunately, and it's actually better to just organize as an LLC rather than as a DAO LLC, even if you are a DAO, because they have some strange restrictions on what takes place with a DAO and the way that the law ended up being written. But they're trying, right? Like they're actually trying to find a way to like, can we make these things legally legible to the state and to legacy financial instruments in a way that people can use. Of course, there's the flip side of, they're also making it legible to taxation and regulation and all these other things. You pick up one end of the stick, you pick up both ends of the stick. So.
Yeah, you mentioned Balaji and like network states and 1729. I mean, I'm involved with the 1729, and I've been going to the lectures in the book because he like way before he published it, and that you saying that around here, it's like hearing someone you could never. I've never heard anyone say anything about like Balaji or anything like that in this campus, which is interesting.
So next week right now I'm on leave from the university as a professor this year, and I'm working at the Urbit Foundation. And we're having a conference in Miami next week called Assembly, and Balaji is actually the keynote there.
Oh, really?
Which is why I've been like paying attention more to what he's been saying. I may actually, I'm going to hear him, I may meet him, so I better know what I'm talking about when I go in there. So.
You think that is?
I think that's what he's going to be talking about, is network state kind of idea.
Yes, he just published a book, so I mean, that's what he's been fully obsessed.
He's doing the tour, yes.
Yeah, so such an interesting guy. Like he created startups, and then he used that, and then he sold it to Coinbase, and he worked at Coinbase, and he was like, okay, now I can do whatever I want, and he's working on this idea, which is the network states.
Mm-hmm. You had a question?
Yeah. So do you think that is the future, like the direction we're heading right now?
Network states as expounded by Balaji in his book. I think there's a reasonable chance that elements of that will happen. I think that what I will call legacy institutions, the currently existing centers of power, are going to fight tooth and nail to not become obsolete, which may make this more or less viable in some ways.
Right.
When you have an army and a police force, it turns out that there's an awful lot of things you can do to prevent startup competition, in a sense. Or you may see states adopt more network state-like provisions themselves, right? So you could imagine one future that goes full accelerationist, cyberpunk network state, and we get something like the Diamond Age, where you have these little fiefdoms that people have membership, their citizenship in, and they can move between them, but there's little homes everywhere that they can go to. And you can imagine on the other end that actually contemporary states become more network-like in a sense. In a regulatory sense, the U.S. sort of already has this, right? I mean, the U.S. dollar as world reserve currency has some things in common with the way we might think about a cryptocurrency. Mm-hmm. It's not deflationary in some of the other aspects you would like, but it can be used as a whatever the monetary equivalent of a lingua franca is, right? Like it is the reserve currency. It's the transaction of choice. If you're going to change, Greek drachmas to Turkish liras, you're going to change to dollars, and you're going to change from dollars. I don't know if they still use drachmas in Greece or if it's all euros now, but anyway. So that influences the way that transactions are done. Citizens of the United States have to pay taxes to the IRS no matter where they live in the world, no matter where the money that they earn takes place. And so there's a regulatory sense in which the United States government would like to treat its citizens as if they are members of a network state called the United States of America. So there's some interest, and there's a lot of room between these two extremes.
Right.
My bet is that we will probably see some interesting attempts to build network state-like things in the next 20 years. I predict that in 20 years, these will probably be kind of like seasteading. Like they're an interesting idea, but they won't have a ton of traction. People will be members of them, but they won't have an army, for instance.
Right.
Right. They'll exist. They'll have certain governance requirements and opportunities that are vested in them. We may see places like Charter Cities and Praxis and Prospera build charter cities that are more like network states. So I could definitely see that happening in the next 20 years. But, for instance, to draw another analogy, let's say we ran out of oil tomorrow. We sucked the last drop of oil out of the ground. There is no more oil. Is Exxon going away?
Definitely not.
Exxon isn't going anywhere. They're going to be an energy company. They may not be an oil company anymore at that point, but they're going to be an energy company because that's where their expertise is. So many, if not all, right? Like big companies go down, and sometimes they go down very hard. But many of the institutions that we have today will continue to exist indefinitely. And I think the safest bet, the most conservative bet, is that they will adopt the adaptive elements of network state like protocol and behavior, or find a way of reaching an entente to accommodate network states that diminishes their power as little as possible.
The only way to survive is to adapt.
In a sense, right? And this is what we've seen continuously. The field of institutional competition is every bit as vicious as the evolutionary state. And there's a reason most companies fall into a few types of forms, because those forms are the most adaptive. And if you did it a different way, you may have things break in a way that is going to make it difficult for you to solve the problem. They're the same kinds of C-suite, middle management, lower workers. Same kinds of stratification get observed over and over again. And of course, that's because it handles the way that information flows through an institution in an efficient and effective way.
Right. So let's talk about Urbit, which is it's a very interesting thing. Where would you like to start with that big?
Okay,
topic?
Yeah, it's a mess, right? It's sort of like it's 1991 and you're talking about Linux, and people are like, "What are, where are you coming from?" Okay, so I've been working with a project called Urbit it bills itself as an attempt to build a clean slate operating system. That we're throwing away Unix, we're throwing away Windows, we're not throwing away the lessons that we learned from building those operating systems, but we're saying that maintaining perpetual backwards compatibility is a mistake. One of the motivations for this, so if you write a line of program code in any language, any common language that we're doing now, Java, Python, HTML, whatever, what relationship does it have to the bits that are pushed around on the physical chip? It's actually pretty much illegible at this point. The software stack has become very tall. If you're running, you're running JavaScript in a web browser that's running on top of libraries that are in an operating system that may have a firmware middle layer, down to the assembly layer. Like there's 5 to 8 layers between what you're actually writing as a software developer and what's actually happening on the chip. In some ways, this is powerful because it lets you write things without regard to a lot of aspects of the hardware that the code is actually going to run on. But it turns out that without the discipline of having to think about memory management or high efficiency, the result has been an enormous amount of software bloat. How big is Microsoft Word? Like if you were actually to go install Microsoft Word on your computer, not the Outlook 365 or whatever the web app that they have now, but like the actual app, it's huge. I mean, it's hundreds of megabytes, if not gigabytes, to install this software. And part of the reason for that is because every time someone has ever had an idea about what it might be useful to have in Microsoft Word, it's been implemented. And once it's implemented, they have to maintain perpetual backwards compatibility so that any version of Word can open any other version of Word. You want to run, you want to go open up Word 5 from 1994, you can open it up. That's not necessarily a bad thing to be able to have that sort of ability to access older information, but it means that the tool that you're working with has become large and unwieldy. Because you haven't had the discipline of being limited on computers by processor speed or memory for a couple of decades now, it means that the software we're writing doesn't really take those things into account at all. It assumes that they're effectively infinite, in a sense. So take that from Microsoft Word and say, okay, like everything you're running on your phone, on your laptop, on the servers that you're interacting with, everything has had that kind of lack of discipline for decades. And it's extremely difficult to figure out what's actually happening. MIT, there's a famous textbook that MIT uses called The Structure and Interpretation of Computer Programs. And it writes things in a dialect of Lisp. And it was very valued for many years. I don't know when they first published it, in the late 80s or early 90s. And one of the values of working with this textbook is that it did a lot of work to tie it to, what's happening on your machine. You write code, what happens in memory? How do these things actually relate to each other? It's trying to build a very firm foundation for you in terms of thinking about how you build something up. At some point, probably in the late aughts, MIT got rid of that program and what they were doing with it, and they started working with Python because they were working with, I believe it was like Arduino little robots or something in their intro class. And so the question came up of like, okay, why did you stop writing with Lisp? And they said, well, Python had the libraries, right? So at that point they were saying what you were doing mechanically with the language was already starting to become decoupled from what the machine that you were working on was doing in some form of representation. Like I say, there's power in that, but there's a loss of discipline in it. So the Urbit project began as an attempt to write an operating system. In some regards, I prefer saying operating platform because it's more like a Java virtual machine. It runs on top of other things, but it provides a uniform specification, a uniform interface for whatever, if you're running Urbit apps and software, it's talking to this virtual machine layer. And then that's talking to whatever is beneath it. It runs, you run it in Unix. In principle, you could run it on bare metal if you wanted to go set everything up, but it talks to that layer. So they said, what if we took and built an operating system, an operating platform that implements all the things we've learned about building good software and good operating systems in the past 50 years and actually just tries to take those things seriously and not worry about the rest of it. Okay. So networking is a first-class primitive operation on your system. It's not something that was added on later as a library. So if you look at the evolutionary history of Windows, if you look at the evolutionary history of Unix, there was this kernel bit that did certain things. It managed a user, it managed memory operations, it had instructions on how do you pull in and work with present a user interface, how do you talk to a keyboard, how do you talk to a mouse, how do you talk to a display. And it didn't know how to do other things, like how to communicate over a network using a particular protocol. It doesn't know about things like blockchains. or a lot of cryptography. And so later on, a lot of these things were rolled back in. They've been reincorporated back in. And so you kind of end up with this Frankenstein kernel where you have all these pieces stitched into it. Some of them are opaque. They're literally bits of binary code that Microsoft or Cisco or IBM sent to them and said, here, stick this in your kernel. And you don't actually really know what it is. You know what they claim it to be, but you don't know what it actually is. So Urbit was an attempt to say, okay, if we're going to take all these things and we're going to make them primitive parts of our operating system, and we're going to make the operating system small enough that one human can understand it. I don't remember what the current lines of code in the kernel is, but last time I checked, I think it was 50, 60,000 lines.
Yeah.
That's small enough that a single human can read everything and figure out what's going on. Most people aren't. Most end users aren't. Most people aren't interested in reading the Linux kernel or the Mach kernel or whatever else you have. That's fine. They don't have to. But the point is that in principle, it's knowable and it's auditable. You can actually verify that the code you think you're running is the code that's running. Right? Like it's reasonably straightforward for you to do that on a platform that makes the assumptions and the guarantees that Urbit seeks to make. Now, that's an extremely computer science nerd level look at like, why are we doing Urbit? Urbit is also an attempt to solve a lot of the problems that have happened with the current internet model as it exists. In the internet today, Web 2.0 in particular, you are the product.
Right.
Your data are the thing that they are harvesting. You've kind of made a Faustian bargain every time you use a platform. And there's, people publish a guide on like how to erase yourself from Google. But like you really can't. Right? I mean, there was a piece, a blog post recently about a fellow who had been he'd been running his own email server for 27 years. So he started running his own email server in 1995, and he just finally gave up on it. Because the problem is that Gmail and Yahoo and XYZ providers were basically filtering spam on the algorithm that if it was coming from someone with a single instance, it's spam and it's never going to get delivered to your inbox. So he was actually unable to even send email functionally in the modern Web 2.0 world. So even though in principle you could still have data sovereignty, in practice, it's actually completely impossible. So what Urbit is trying to do is it's building a purely decentralized network where you own your chunk of the network. You cryptographically own the token that certifies that you are who you say you are. You have a single point of identity on the network, and you're saying, I am this person, and I can cryptographically prove it because there's a public key infrastructure that lets anyone else check any message I send, and they can see that I am who I say I am. So but it's also purely decentralized in the sense that if I publish software on there, you can grab my software. There's no app store. There's no middleman. So what you're able to do is, it's sort of like if you took Signal and you made an operating system out of it. What if everything worked that way? And what if instead of having every app build its own model and ship that model, ship that single instance of software, what if everything worked kind of like the Microsoft Office suite where you can take a table from Excel and you can paste it into Word, and you might have to fiddle with it a little bit to get it to look like a table or something, but like it works, right? They know about each other. What if every app on your phone knew about every other app? Like in a data secure way. If you wanted to pull data from one context and treat it as a contact, or treat it as a video call, or treat it as an avatar in a game, or whatever you want to do with this chunk of information, you would have that capability. And in many ways, this is a world that Richard Stallman and GNU Linux and Free Software Foundation and a lot of the cypherpunks in the early 90s, they were pointing at building this kind of world, and they laid a lot of the intellectual and theoretical groundwork that made it possible. But all of the alternatives that they had previously proposed didn't really do what was expected or hoped for or claimed for a variety of reasons. Things like well, if you need to talk to this bit of driver, they're only going to let you talk to it if you're running this blob of code. Urbit doesn't completely solve that because Urbit doesn't deal with the hardware layer yet. Maybe someday we'll get to it. But right now we're trying to deal with the software networking side of you are who you say you are, you own your data, the address space is finite, so it's kind of like Bitcoin, it's deflationary, there's only so much address space available, which also means that spamming is disincentivized because if you own something if you own a unique token and that token is worth something until you start acting like a jerk to everyone else, then you've lost value. You've destroyed value on the network, right? Sort of like imagine Bitcoin, but every Bitcoin is numbered. I mean, in a sense, this is what happens with governments who blacklist wallets or they like Tornado Cash, right? Where people are trying to get around it with mixers, but there are certain wallets that have been blacklisted, and so therefore you're not allowed to do transactions involving these wallets. Urbit is trying to solve the problem of disincentivizing bad behavior on the network by saying your address space, the point you exist at and identify yourself at on the network, is scarce. It exists and it is a thing that anyone else can talk to, but if you act badly, they don't have to talk to you anymore. And you don't necessarily have a way around it unless you have another point and you're going to act better on that point. And it also would mean that it's forever burned. You could sell it to someone else, and if they start acting nice, then the censures will be taken off and everyone can be happy and move forward. But you can't have the indiscriminate spam bots and just the total junk that we have on the web today.
Right. So one of the things that you mentioned was interesting is okay, everyone would own their own network, right? But so the logic behind most of the companies today is they're mining our data because they can make profits out of it, right? They're selling the data. So there needs to be some business model to make this profitable. So if we transition to a network stake like Urbit, how would we keep it profitable? Or would profits even make sense in this regard?
So there's a few ways you could potentially do that. For one thing, you may be running infrastructure for other people. You could be a hosting provider. You're running the cloud machines that their Urbit instance, which is called a ship, that their Urbit ship is running on. They log into it, they own the cryptographic keys and everything, but you're providing the actual hardware that they're running on. There are people that are already running companies based on that business model. You could be various kinds of a service provider on the network. Maybe you sell your software, right? Maybe you act as some kind of validator in a layer 1 blockchain that gets built on Urbit. There are people working on questions like that. Maybe you provide real world benefits, kind of like Bored Apes Yacht Club, right? There was a certain cachet to having one of those NFTs and being able to go to clubs and parties because you had that NFT and no one else did. Well, maybe that's one way that you could make money on Urbit. Like by participating at this particular point, having this star as your sponsor, you're in the club, right? Maybe you pay dues. Maybe you have to participate in some way to compensate the trouble of running this, but there's a payoff for doing that. You can also, you could sell address space. You could sell access to certain kinds of information. So you could imagine a world where you are running game servers and what you give everyone is a client. So it's sort of like Steam where everyone's running a client, but the core game that they're interacting with is running on your instance.
Right.
Everyone's talking to it, but you didn't actually give anyone the code for what is the world building and the combat mechanics and everything. They're just communicating via you, but they have to pay to have access to, keep up that subscription. So I think there will be other viable business models insofar as that goes.
Yeah, that's what people will need to figure out, like the different businesses and different things. But in a way, Urbit it's a new tool. And Marshall McLuhan, he said, we become what we behold, and we shape our tools, and our tool shape us back.
Yes.
Which goes back to the question that you were saying, that a lot of these internet communities, they don't go broad in a sense. They go really specific, and they they find they make it really hard for people to be part of it, or not hard, like make it like there's some
Everything is a niche.
exactly,
Yeah.
and there's some sort of a level that you need to have in order to be part of this. And in Urbit, in a way that you mentioned, is like trying to rebuild everything from first principles. And like for instance, like Hoon, the Urbit language goes back to the model that, you know, it's a new tool that would get to put in your terms. It would give you disciplines in a way as you're thinking once you're building these new apps and the new things in Urbit.
Right. There's sort of a Sapir-Whorf hypothesis going on there, right? That the language you speak shapes the worldview that you hold. Right. And so the computing language that you are fluent in or that you are using at a particular point does shape the kinds of things that you build and the ways in which you build those things. So one model that I really like for thinking about what Urbit is trying to do. If you look at the old web, like ARPANET, so you know we're going back to the 80s and Usenet. One of the reasons that these succeeded, besides having massive amounts of Department of Defense funding, is that the people who participated on them already had strong social and cultural norms to behave in a certain way. They were mainly technical professionals of one kind or another. They were professors, they were grad students, they were military commsmen, whatever. This governed them behaving in a particular way. As Usenet evolved in the late 80s and early 90s, some of those norms of discourse started to break down and you started to get very heated flame wars. It's actually funny to go back and look because like they're super tame compared to a lot of the junk that went on later on. But this was, old man Davis shakes his cane at you. But like people were not behaving as well as they had previously. And then with the initial web, there was a lot of idealism, but what ultimately happened was Twitter. Okay. Twitter's good and bad. Twitter's bad because the engagement algorithm rewards pretty antisocial behavior, right? Like brigading people or the various kinds of heated arguments or trying to get people canceled for various things that they said. It's not a healthy model. And so you can think of Twitter as like player versus player world, right? Like everyone's out there running around in gangs trying to get headshots on the other team and take them out. Like this is what Twitter is. Now, Twitter is good because the ideas and the memes that survive that kind of environment presumably have some sort of adaptive benefit if we're going back to kind of the evolutionary model that we were alluding to earlier. Like the things that survive Twitter or Twitter discourse seem to be the strongest forms of those things. It doesn't mean that they're true or not, but it means that the weaker forms have been culled by the constant bickering and argumentation. But Twitter's hostile. And that's basically Web 2.0. Like all of it is like that. Facebook is like that. Like everything sort of behaves in this antisocial way. So what DAOs in general and Urbit in specific are trying to do is they're building a world of the village green. They're building a world where you can actually build a village of the people that you know and value and want to discourse with. And you can do that. And you don't actually have to go out into PvP world unless you want to go out into PvP world. And if you do, fantastic, have fun. Happy hunting, right? Like go do something interesting. But if you don't want to, you can still be online in a way that doesn't bleed over into the broader discourse in a compulsory manner, right? Like there was, even if you're on Facebook, the Facebook algorithm and feed is not going to leave you alone, right? It is trying to manipulate the things that you're thinking and the things that you're saying. People want to pattern match this into political discourse up front, but it's everything, right? Every corporation is fighting for its sliver of your attention, right? Attention is the coin of the realm. That's the thing that everyone's fighting for. The politicians are fighting for it. but everyone else is fighting for it too, right? Disney's fighting for it. Like it's just everything is fighting for your attention. And what we're trying to build socially now is the world where you have these village greens where your attention is once again your own. Like where you can make contextual decisions for how you want to spend your attention rather than being at the mercy of this completely open global namespace where anything can intervene at any point, right? Like there's a sense in which tabbed browsing is kind of the first layer of this curse because you can context switch so quickly that it's actually hard to keep track of what's going on. But it's the ability to build the kind of community that you want was something that we had in ancient environments in various ways. Most people probably wouldn't have challenged the community they were given very much. You had your tribe. You're going to stick with your tribe. They're the people who understand you. Or your town or your club or your bowling league or whatever. You'd find ways of making meaning. And this has been breaking down, as has been widely recognized and lamented for a long time. But DAOs are a way to start building that anew in a very different kind of environment. And to the extent that Urbit supports people building DAOs, I think it supports that sort of very, very pro-social behavior where you can actually delimit and say, this is the kind of community and environment I want to live in. And the nice thing about Urbit being purely decentralized is that once you've all found each other, you actually don't have to interface much with the broader world at all. No one else has to know you're there. They don't have to know that you're talking about the things you're talking about. They don't have to know that you're thinking about the things you're thinking about. You can just do it. You don't have to have a strong opinion on the latest Marvel movie or whatever else is going on. Like that's this safe context in which you can act in a certain way. And so this is what I see the best DAOs are building. A point I made before the show chat was right now crypto's kind of in this crypto winter, right? It's in this bear market. And the great thing about that is that the things that survive a bear market are real. Right? The things that there was, if you go back to 2019, there was so much hype. It was impossible to separate signal from noise because everything was noise, right? People were, you want to roll your own NFT, you want to blockchain everything. Like that was like 2016. It's like, we're going to put a blockchain in everything, right? Like, what does this even mean? Right? It was just this buzzword. The same way that big data was, 5 years before then. Everything was like, we're going to do big data. Big data is data that you can't fit in an Excel spreadsheet. But like, other than that, like, what is big data? It's anything. It's everything. And so what happens now is there's this culling of the non-serious projects, right? The projects that don't actually solve a problem that people have, or that were done in a bad faith way, where they're just trying to extract money from a particular target market or set of investors. Those things are going to go away. And the things that are around now and 6 months from now and a year from now are the things that collectively we are deciding are real. At least the people who watch these things. And those are going to be the things that the next platforms are built on. Now, when we talk about something like a DAO, I think that what DAOs will become will look fairly different from what we think of as a DAO now, right? A DAO now it's a Discord chat and it's a governance token and it's some bylaws. Maybe there's some other things going on. I think that we can actually probably pretty adaptively get rid of or significantly modify any one of those elements and still have something that is DAO-ish, even though today we wouldn't call it a DAO, right? Like new forms are going to evolve that we don't recognize yet, that we don't see yet. But when they come around, then we'll say, okay, yes, this is clearly, it's a network state, even though it doesn't meet the definition. It's a DAO, even though it doesn't meet what we thought was a DAO in 2022. And I think those things are going to be the things that are going to carry us forward. A monastery is kind of a DAO. A university, right? You go back to an original university, you're in Paris in 1250, or at the University of Paris, you go to Oxford. It's a college of professors, ones who profess knowledge, and the students are contracting them to teach classes. This was the original structure. The students were actually holding the professor's feet to the fire to teach them classes. And there are these funny rules around, how do you get these people involved? But a college in that sense was something like I wouldn't call it a DAO. It's a COW, right? It's a centralized autonomous organization, but it's an association of people that were trying to build something very different from anything that had existed up to that point. And it turned out that it was incredibly versatile. It was a very powerful backbone, and it's incredibly versatile. And while what we call today university doesn't look much like what a university looked like in 1820, and doesn't look much like what a university looked like in 1250, the form has continued to adapt and change. And even though I'm interested in post-academic forms of scholarship and research, I also recognize that just as Exxon is not going to go away if the last drop of oil goes away, there will be something that calls itself a university 1,000 years from now.
Right.
It may not look a whole lot like anything we recognize now, but there will be universities 1,000 years from now. They just may also change. There's a lot of value in the credentialing and the endowment and the cultural momentum that's all wrapped up in that. And that's nothing to laugh at. Like that's a very serious summit of human effort and endeavor that have gotten them to that point. So, I don't know where I'm going with that.
But it's funny that you mentioned universities, because it's something that, like, you're talking about Web 3, right? And it's going to be fundamentally different from Web 2. And like, if you look at university, like, sure, they've changed over the years. Like, you add some elements, okay, it's like more technologically driven, or like, oh, you're having more projects, or like, but like the essence is still the same, where like you have a structure that students come in and you just learn and you leave, right? Mm-hmm. Sure, it has like evolved a little, but it's still not fundamentally different than what it started with. Do you think there's a shift that needs to happen in terms of our education system and just how institutions are run today to better adapt to what the future is going to hold for us?
That's a huge question.
Can I give you more context to
Go for it.
So this guy, he wanted to go talk to the dean of the engineering school.
Okay.
I already knew the answer, but I didn't. It was a conversation that I didn't want to have because I knew the answer to, and I didn't want to hear the answer, if you know what I mean. But so.
But you got to try.
Right. I mean, of course. I mean, yeah. Why not? In essence, what the conversation was about is that we have these institutions, and individuals cannot rise in a way. Like, we're in engineering school, we should be seeing people trying cool projects and just doing things. Like on the quad, we should be seeing like drones and projects and just creativity.
Okay.
Yet what we see is a bunch of people doing homework and a bunch of people
piled up in like Granger or
and not really thinking about what they want to do and how they contribute to their careers. We got there, thinking about these questions generally, and we told them that, we go in there, and the answer that we get, like, we don't get pushed away, but we kind of do in a formal way, and it's just like we're running a big institution and we're doing things that are scalable, and because of that, that's excuse why we're bad in a way. Like, that's literally what they said, because we're a big institution, we're doing things at a scale, therefore it kind of works for everyone.
Right. There are certain problems that you run into at the scale of a state university which make it infeasible to scale things back down, is basically what he's saying there.
Right. But I think I find it funny. We see these buildings, and like SIF. I don't know if you've been there. Bunch of people, and we kind of
look up to them. Where in reality, these people were individuals doing their own thing, doing crazy things. But in today's environment, those people are not supported. Those people are not. It's not a conducive environment where they can thrive, or they can find ways to do the things that they want to do.
Okay, I have good news and bad news for you.
Sure.
And the really bad news is they're the same. It's the same thing, which is that initiative has always been hard, and it's been the road less taken. Right? There's nothing stopping you from building a drone or doing Arduino. And I would actually suggest that while trying to get it in the classes is its own kind of initiative, it's probably one that's going to be an uphill battle. Right? It's going to be hard to get classes to commit to that level of resources for a variety of reasons. But just going and doing it is something I highly encourage, right? Like take the initiative, seize the initiative, go do interesting things. Every time you walk by a door, try the handle, see if it's open. Maybe there's something behind it. You'll find things that you don't expect, right? Go to, talk to people, go to events, do things that are outside of your normal routine, because that's how you're gonna, taking the initiative to go outside of that normalcy is how you are going to find the unusual things. Not everyone who graduated from University of Illinois has their portrait on a wall looking at you, right? Like numerically, that fraction is extremely extremely small, and it has always been small. And that's fine, right? Like I'm also cagey of going too far in the initiative direction, because I think that there are a lot of people who are happy exercising fairly low levels of initiative, and trying to demand that they exercise higher initiative would probably make them deeply unhappy. And I want to be charitable towards that. It doesn't make them bad people. Like we need the lights on every day. We need the buses running. Like we need a lot of things to run a society.
Right.
And the like full respect to the people who do that and for whom that is their lot. For the people who want more, who want something different than that, they are probably, for the most part, going to have to find a way to carve that out. It's not a thing that's going to happen to them by the intention of someone else. It can happen accidentally, right? Like you can definitely, like you will definitely find that most of the important things that happen in your life are accidents. They're things that you will stumble into. You'll be in the right place at the right time. I got a job here at the university because I went to a conference and met someone who gave me a business card and told me to look up an online program that I participated in that gave me the skills that got me my first job out of grad school, right? Like just complete accident. He was one of only 2 people I talked to seriously at the whole conference, right? Like really, really narrow spectrum, like this is contingent. It's the thing that happened. So you're going to be relying a lot on those, but you don't know what those are going to be. So once you start taking the initiative to expose yourself to as many of those kinds of things as possible, you are going to find more opportunities coming up. If you decide you are going to build a scale model of a glider and see if you can actually get it to fly, there are people and resources and opportunities that are going to come about because of that you don't know right now. You can't predict them. You don't know what they're going to be. You're going to have to go to a hobby shop, or you're going to have to go to a junkyard, or you're going to have to go talk to some professor that you've never met before. And it's going to push you in directions that you have no idea where those are going to take you. So go fly drones on the quad. Go do it. There are things we could be doing with the variety of education that take us beyond what we're doing now. But it's not apparent to me that just doing those things is going to get us better outcomes. Because you could also teach a class in such a way that you give 100 students a drone and 99 of them still do the homework and then hand the drone back in, and that's the end of it. Right? It's still it's an exercise in credentialing. It's an exercise in completing. This is the hoop I have to jump through bureaucratically to get to the next hoop. And that's the thing I'm going to do. So if you want more than that, go find more than that. Go do more than that.
Yeah, and I mean, before I knew it's a bad question, and I mean, it's a bad question, which will give you a bad answer because they're not gonna give us. I mean, the whole setup was flawed in a way because if you want to do these things, it's like nothing is stopping us, and funnily enough,
If you are waiting for permission, I give you permission.
Oh no, I mean,
Go do it. Go do things.
I
No, but I mean, in a sense, like there's a psychological sense
Yeah.
in which people wait for permission, and they don't have to wait for permission. It turns
We-
out, but like everyone, like all humans do this. We do this all the time. We wait for permission to do things. You don't need permission to do things. Go do things.
we asked for forgiveness, not permission.
Yeah, that's the approach, right? That's the attitude.
yeah, and
You're gonna have way more fun that way.
and we went to Quad Day, and supposedly you're supposed to be registered. I just called my friend, hey, let me borrow a table. We brought a table. We found a spot, set up the table. Even people from the yearbook came taking us pictures, and it'll be funny because we're not technically registered, so we're not gonna show up anyway, anywhere. So I mean,
Yeah.
hopefully they'll
Fantastic,
put us up.
right?
It was the most fun we've had, like, because we met so many people, like, you would never meet, because they would be curious, oh, what is this? They would, like, see a talk show, like, oh, this sounds interesting, and they would, like, we met, like, we were limited by just the two of us, so, like, there were people who still wanted to talk, but they would just have to leave because we would be talking to someone, but it was just, we met so many interesting people, we were asking them questions on the spot, and it's just fun to, like, see the kind of people that you have on campus.
So there's an interesting development that's been taking place in courseware. So historically, we've had things like Blackboard, Compass, and we've had Moodle and Coursera and all these. These are what are called learning management systems, right? They're very authoritarian, high modern in the sense that they lay out a program, a rubric of activities, and they track your progress in those activities in a very concrete way. Lately, there's been a shift. There's a program called XAPI, and it's what's called a learning records or learning recording system. And the idea is actually that rather than try and get this prefab rubric of what learning looks like, you go actually try and track what students do. I mean, you give them some ideas, you give them direction. You don't just leave them to figure out the whole class on their own, but you track everything they do. That they register with you. They read this web page. They did this experiment. They went out and looked at rocks in the creek for an hour. And so you're observing the behavior of students rather than mandating the behavior of the students. And I think this opens up an interesting possibility to be able to turn this around then. And in 10 years, when we have better records like this, we'll be able to say, we actually know what a successful student is going to do. And we don't have to write it as a rubric. Maybe we do because we know what that is. But we've observed, several generations of students completing activities, and we actually know what activities are successful. Well, they actually bring them to the end to which the course is conducting them. So.
You think there can be decentralization in an education system?
Yes, I do. That is something I intend to spend a substantial amount of time working and thinking about in the next while.
Why is that?
Well, I mean, it's an interesting problem. It gets at the root of, circling back around to where we were at the beginning, like what sort of life is a well-lived life? Mm-hmm. What sort of education is a good education is a question that people are going to disagree on, but it's also a question that how do I put this? By funding the reservoir of tools and operations that people have available to them, they will be able to imaginatively construct what they need. Right? You're not saying this is the education you must have, right?
Right.
Let's say I don't want to get a degree in zoology. Let's say I want to get a degree in water. Mm-hmm. This doesn't exist, but I want to get a degree in water. I want to know about hydrology. I want to know about chemistry. I want to know about like treatment. I want to know about mythology. I want to know about water. And that's the thing I want to do with my life is learn about water. There's no way to do that in the current system, right? Like the flip side of disciplines arose for certain path-dependent historical reasons, but they draw artificial boundaries that constrain the way we think about it. Sapir-Whorf hypothesis again. They constrain the way that we think about the problem space in very powerful and subtle ways. And even though there's a lot of talk about, well, let's do cross-disciplinary work or have people meet up from different departments, it sort of never really cracks open the highly siloized nature of a discipline. You know, like once you've gone through the undergrad process and you've got a degree in some particular topic, you know, you got your degree in physics, you still think of it as physics as distinct from, you know, we've cleared this zone around it from everything else, and this is physics. This is my thing, and it's the thing I understand. It's the way that I interpret it and I think about the world. If that's your jam, that's fantastic. But if you'd like to think about the world very differently, if you'd like to carve reality at different joints, to use Plato's term, then like there's functionally no way to do this at this point. Moving to something more like a decentralized educational system, wherein we are able to track and record certain components of, I mean, we can't get rid of credentialing. Credentialing serves important purposes, but we won't have to say, you know, did you complete this 4-year degree? We'll be able to say, have you ever studied ordinary differential equations? Right? Okay, great, fantastic. Right? Or maybe, you know, we're doing something really strange and we're looking for someone with puppeteering experience and you know the water degree or something, right? Like you don't know what that project's going to be.
Right.
But if you increase the granularity of the way that you're able to legibly see human activity, human education, then you will be able to pick these things out more clearly. And this is going to open up possibilities in both the educational side and the utilization of education side that, you know, currently we don't really have a good idea about, because why would we think about that? Like, it's literally impossible for us to get that kind of information.
And that's exactly what I was saying before. Like, if you want a degree in water, if you want to just do this thing, like, there's literally no way to do it in the system, which was kind of what I was getting at before. I don't know if you saw today, but a big company, Figma, got acquired by Adobe for $20 billion. And also today, the Ethereum, the merge thing happened. And both of those people, they have a very interesting common history, is that they're both Thiel fellows, with the Thiel fellowship thing, which in a way, not necessarily, but it created a way for them, a system as a way for them to do this thing outside of the system. I don't know if you've heard much about this thing this guy did, Thiel.
Yeah, I mean, he's an investor that's in a lot of places, in a lot of interesting places, and backing things that are, in a sense, seem to be countercultural. So there's some interesting things going on, and I would actually like to know a lot more about his philosophy of society and technology. He has been fairly tight-lipped about those things, but I think there's some sort of method to his madness that is not apparent from the outside that I would be curious to know more about.
I'll send you an essay.
Okay.
Someone wrote. It's about basically a lot of his philosophy is based on René Girard.
Okay.
Mimetic theory.
Okay.
So to, you know, what advice would you give? You know, I guess we're both college students, and let's say we wanted to get involved in Urbit and you just build this thing. What would you say? What needs to be built? How can you get involved?
So The easiest proximate way is we're actually running a hackathon in September, starting September 30th and running through October 29th here at the university, ucforuc.com. So it's Urbit Cardano for Urbana-Champaign. And it's jointly, the main funding for the prizes comes from the Project Catalyst, which is a Cardano blockchain initiative. And we have some support from Urbit Foundation as well. So we're running a local hackathon, which will let people, if they're interested in this, get involved with both technologies. Cardano is one that a lot of people are building DAOs on. So if you're interested in DAOs, if you're interested in building things on these kinds of platforms, that's one place to start. Urbit specifically, I have been working on building better curriculum, better ways of learning the platform, getting involved with it. So there's a level of like, oh, you're a software developer, or you're not a software developer yet, but you're interested in doing it. That's one, contact me and I will be happy to point you at all sorts of resources, or I teach a live course from time to time. I'm going to teach it again, pretty much contemporaneous with the hackathon. So starting, I think, September 27th. And yeah, so there's that aspect. If you're interested in just seeing what Urbit is as a platform and playing with it and participating in some of the social milieu that exists on top of it, then you can head to urbit.org and start poking around there, or reach out to me and I'll be happy to onboard you and give you an idea of how to work with and be involved with things and see where it goes from there.
Awesome.
So.
We have a section at the end. We call it underrated, overrated.
Okay.
We just ask you, we give you a prompt, and we want to see what you think about it. You can just answer with if you think it's underrated or overrated.
Okay.
So one thing we wanted to ask you is John Carmack. Underrated, overrated?
I'm going to go with underrated.
I would expect
because he does BJJ. So, but he does some interesting things. I mean, he's well respected.
Right.
And he actually did some interesting work on one of the when Neil Ferguson's lab in England was doing COVID modeling at Imperial College London, and they all of a sudden had to release their code, and their code was completely untenable. He actually got involved and did some of the cleanup on that code too, so they could publish it and it looked good. Academic code can be a really scary thing, as it turns out.
Right.
So.
He's working on AGI now.
Yeah.
So it'll be interesting to see. CS 101, underrated or overrated?
It probably depends on who you're talking to. I mean, I'm a little biased because I've taught the class since 2015, and I've recently handed it off to someone else. I would probably need to know more about the reputation of it to say whether or not it's over or underrated. I can imagine among the faculty who use it downstream, it's probably slightly overrated. Really? I think the class has a good reputation for teaching the tools and things that are ongoing, but I think we spend some time in the weeds on, we teach 6 lessons on MATLAB, and I'm not really sure that that's necessary, for instance. So
yeah, MATLAB comes really late, and then you don't really go over it over the finals too. So.
Well, the fundamental problem with the class is that it was negotiated to a truce by something like 17 different departments, what the curriculum would be. And so as the professor, you don't have the ability to say, well, I'm just only going to teach Python, or I'm going to teach Python and C, or what have you. It used to be C MATLAB, that's what they did. And I actually proposed at one point, well, why don't we split it and we have 101 be Python and we do a CS 104 that's the same content, but it's MATLAB only. And I was told that, well, while a 101 Python, it would be high impact, a 104 MATLAB would be low impact, therefore the whole thing is low impact. And I said, well, that's backwards. The impact is the highest impact that the whole thing would have. So we never quite got enough energy to escape that local minimum.
Yeah, I think he took it. I think it was required for me, and I just decided to skip it. And
Blow it off.
No. I took the actual CS, the
125, yeah.
which was amazing class.
Now 124, but it would have been 125.
Yeah, that class,
probably then.
you know, it was Java, so I guess
Right.
it goes back to the question. It was a little harder, not just Python. You need more discipline and gives you more.
Well, it's rigorous in a way that 101 is not trying to be.
Right.
Right. 101 is, to some extent, it's a black box class. And it's saying, we're going to give you an idea of how things are done, but in practice, as a scientist or an engineer, you probably don't care. Right? Like, programming is the tax you have to pay to do your job. It's not a thing you enjoy for its own sake. Like, maybe some people do. I've had people who take 101 and then they switch into CS and they go to CS. But for a lot of people, you know, they want to look at distillation columns in chemical engineering, or they want to look at gear shafts in mechanical engineering or something, and that's what excites them. And to the extent they ever have to program, they have to.
Right.
But it's like using a calculator. Like, you're not going to get excited about it. So.
Last one.
Okay.
We talked about operating systems. One of the most widely known operating system, I would say, macOS. We touched on Linux, Windows, but we never talked about the Apple ecosystem. So macOS, in your opinion?
Overrated. I think there were a lot of good foundational ideas, but as with everything else, the stack has become out of bounds. The other thing that really drives me nuts about the whole Apple tech stack is the lack of transparency that it has, and that Apple has continuously exercised. You know, we can't help you, you know, get into your phone that you forgot the password for. Oh, but we also give all your data to the FBI, right? Like, they're kind of in between on those things. So while I did have a period from about 2013 until probably 2016, 2017, when I was on Apple platform, I liked how well it just worked out of the box, but I did not like how opaque and how out of my control it felt when I was using it.
Because like Urbit is like the exact opposite of what you would imagine macOS, because you can look at the code, you can customize it, you can make it your own. They're different in many ways, but like I would imagine like if network states like Urbit like blow up in the future, what companies like Apple would have to do to adapt to a structure that is just completely opposite of what they follow.
Well, maybe you're part of the Apple network state. Right? I mean, it's not like Apple processes are any less opaque than U.S. government processes.
Right.
I mean, especially when you think about like what happens in back rooms and everything, like everything's opaque, right? The world that is transparent is the new thing we're building. That's what's different. That's what's unprecedented.
Right.
The world's been opaque forever.
Very true.
Thank you very much for coming and talking to us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
It was great. It was amazing. Like these are topics like we don't usually talk to with other people, because you cannot really like. These are niche topics, right? So it's always fun to have someone talk about this.
Well, I enjoyed it. Good chat. Let me see what time I'm at, because 7.
Yeah, perfect.
And thank you to everyone for watching. I'm sure you had as much fun as we did talking or just listening and learning about Web 3.0, the direction we're heading as a society, being more transparent with everything, with all these tech companies that you do, and just thinking in a way that is unprecedented to how we do things right now. We hope we can get a chance to talk more about this again in the future, if you're up to it. And yeah, I still have a lot of things I would like to talk to you about, and a lot of things I would like to learn. So very thankful for you coming here, and we wish you the very best for your future at Urbit.
Anytime. Thank you.
Stay curious, and we'll see you guys in the next one.